When William Henry Vanderbilt died in 1885, the largest personal fortune in the world passed into the hands of his 8 children, $200 million. He had almost doubled what his father, the Commodore, had built across a lifetime of railroad wars and waterfront deals, and he was the last Vanderbilt who would ever add a dollar to it. By 1973, when about 120 of the family's descendants gathered at Vanderbilt University in Nashville for a reunion, there was not a millionaire among them. $200 million, the greatest fortune in America, spent to nothing by the people who inherited it. Not by a crash, not by a swindle, not by a revolution. By spending. William Henry had divided it 8 ways. His 2 eldest sons, Cornelius the Second and William Kissam, each received about $70 million. His 6 younger children received about $10 million each, and he handed all of it over as outright cash and railroad stock, with no trust to lock the principal, no family office to manage it, and no rule to stop any heir from spending every dollar however he pleased. There was no mechanism to compel the heirs to invest, no family council to govern how the money moved, and no legal wall between any heir and the full balance of his share. Once the money was spent, there was nothing to replace it. The railroad stock paid dividends, but any heir could sell the stock itself and spend every dollar of the proceeds. The fortune that had taken 2 lifetimes to build was, in a single document, 8 separate piles of cash with nothing underneath them. And when those 8 piles were spent, or spent in part, they would be divided again among the next generation, and the shares would be smaller still, and there would be no mechanism to stop the dilution. The fortune that had been 1 thing in the Commodore's hands and 8 things in his grandchildren's hands would soon be 100 things, and then nothing at all. William Henry had made his money the patient way. He ran the New York Central Railroad for 8 years after the Commodore's death in 1877, consolidated the Allied lines, doubled the estate, and died at 64 as the richest man in America. But unlike the Commodore, who had concentrated the fortune in a single heir, William Henry divided the money among all of his children and divided it without restriction. No trust, no conditions, no mechanism of any kind. Every heir received his share outright, free to spend, free to lose, free to give away. The generation that received those shares had grown up in the grandest houses on Fifth Avenue in New York City, surrounded by servants and tutors, introduced to a society that measured standing in marble facades and European titles, and the square footage of summer cottages on the Rhode Island coast. None of them had ever built an enterprise. None of them had ever run the railroad that paid for everything they owned. Their ambition was not to grow the fortune. It was to spend it. They would pour their father's money into the largest houses the country had ever seen, into marriages to the European aristocracy, into divorces that cost millions, and into a social position purchased 1 marble room at a time. What followed was one of the fastest dispersals of wealth in American history, played out heir by heir, dollar by dollar, house by house. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, the eldest son, inherited about $70 million and spent the next 14 years doing something that looked, from a distance, like stewardship. The New York Central's dividends came in. The money covered the houses and the servants and the season in Newport. But Cornelius II built nothing new. He grew no asset and expanded no enterprise. He spent on scale instead. The Breakers, his summer residence in Newport, Rhode Island, rose 70 rooms on the coast, a mansion built to declare to every society family on the shore that the Vanderbilts had arrived. On Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, he raised the largest private residence New York City had ever seen, a house that required 37 servants to keep its rooms lit and its hallways clean. These were monuments, and monuments do not pay dividends. The money that went into those houses was gone the moment it was spent. Mansions do not compound the way railroad stock compounds. They cost money to build, cost money to maintain, and return nothing. Every dollar that went into marble and servants was a dollar that would never grow. When Cornelius II died in 1899, per the appraisal of his estate, the number came back at $72,999,867. 14 years with the greatest fortune in America, and the ledger was awash. The money had not grown. It had held, and holding was all he managed. A fortune of $70 million, left in the hands of a professional family office, would have compounded. Left in the hands of a man building mansions and staffing them, it held even at best. And even was not good enough, because the money would split again when Cornelius the Second died, and the shares would be smaller, and there would be nothing left over to cushion the next generation. The first heir in the Vanderbilt line had already demonstrated the central flaw. Without growth, the fortune was losing ground, because the costs of the next generation would be higher and the shares would be smaller. But the real damage he left behind was not in the balance sheet. It was in a document. His eldest son, Cornelius the Third, known as Neely, had fallen in love with a woman named Grace Wilson. His father considered the match beneath the family and forbade the wedding. Neely married her anyway, in the summer of 1896, and Cornelius the Second answered with one of the coldest instruments any Vanderbilt ever signed. He dated his will the 18th of June, 1896, the exact date of the wedding he had tried to stop. Inside that will, his eldest son was cut to a bequest of $500,000 and a $1 million trust. His younger brother, Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt, was named the principal heir, with about $42 million. The father did not just disinherit his son. He stamped the date of the offense into the legal record so the reason would outlive them both. Cornelius III would spend the rest of his life on what that will allowed and whatever Alfred chose to send him. He worked as an engineer and lived 27 years estranged from his mother before a reconciliation that came too late to change anything about the money. He was the only Vanderbilt heir punished not for squandering the fortune, but for choosing a wife. And the money that was taken from him did not go to someone who would grow it. It went to Alfred. The $42 million that should have been his brother's went instead to Alfred, who was now at 22 one of the richest young men in America. Alfred took his $42 million and lived with the freedom that the money and the absence of any restriction around it allowed. A divorce settlement cost him more than $10 million in a single stroke. He gave $6 million more to his disinherited brother, because Alfred had a generous streak that ran alongside the extravagance. He kept thoroughbred horses, traveled between the drawing rooms of New York and the race courses of England, and spent at the pace of a man who believed the money had no bottom. By his mid-30s, he had consumed close to 2/5 of everything he inherited, and there was nothing underneath the fortune to replenish what went out, no business, no trust, no mechanism of any kind, because the will that had placed $42 million in his hands had provided none. On the 7th of May, 1915, Alfred boarded the RMS Lusitania in New York for the crossing to Liverpool. He was 37 years old. A torpedo took the ship down off the coast of Ireland. Alfred could not swim. Witnesses said he gave his life belt to a young mother holding an infant, per witness accounts, and helped others into the boats. His body was never recovered. Whatever else the Vanderbilts lost in those decades of spending and splitting, Alfred's death on the Lusitania was not a story about money. It was the one moment in the family's long decline where a Vanderbilt heir stood for something other than what he had spent. The man who could not swim and had no life belt turned out to be worth more than his inheritance. He left behind an estate diminished by spending and generosity, to be divided again among his own heirs, folded back into the same current that carried every Vanderbilt dollar downstream. The structure was always the same. Cash came in and cash went out, and nothing held. And the next heir's story would prove the point from a different angle. Not a dramatic collapse, but something more revealing. A fortune frozen in place for an entire lifetime. William Kissam Vanderbilt, the second eldest son, inherited $55 million and did something that looks, at first glance, like the steadiest hand in the family. He held on. Over 35 years, he spent on the most lavish scale any Vanderbilt achieved and still died in 1920, with an estate appraised at $54,530,966.59 per the appraisal of his estate. He ended within a rounding error of where he started. The number is a mirage. Start with what William Kissam spent that can be counted. He built Marble House in Newport, Rhode Island, for $11 million, $7 million of that in marble alone. He paid his first wife, Alva, more than $10 million in their divorce, one of the largest settlements of the 19th century. And he put more than $17 million into marrying his daughter, Consuelo, to the 9th Duke of Marlborough, purchasing a European aristocratic title the way his father had once purchased railroad stock. The marriage was a transaction, and the price was more than $17 million of Vanderbilt money delivered to an English estate for a title that would attach to the family name. Those three expenditures alone exceed $38 million. His estate at death was $54.5 million. The arithmetic is clear. The dividends from his railroad stock covered every dollar of that spending every year for 35 years. But the arithmetic reveals something else. Every cent of income across an entire working lifetime was consumed. Nothing was reinvested and nothing was set aside. William Kissam did not destroy the fortune in a single act of recklessness. He spent everything the money produced and grew nothing. When he died, his estate passed to his two sons, who inherited a fortune that had generated no surplus for a generation. Running in place, in a family with no trust and no operating business, was a slow walk toward zero. The fortune William Kissam left was not a living fortune. It was a frozen one. $54 million with no income history, no growth, and no operating business behind it, to be split again among his sons, who would face the same arithmetic with half the starting balance. The Vanderbilt money was not being spent in a way anyone would call reckless. It was being spent in the way the will had allowed, and the will had allowed everything. Reginald Claypool Vanderbilt received the least of the brothers and burned through it the fastest. He inherited $1,250,000 in cash, plus a $5 million trust. The trust was the only piece of the entire Vanderbilt fortune that carried a restriction. Its principal was locked. It had to remain invested, and Reginald could draw from the income but never touch the balance. The outright cash had no such wall. Per Arthur Vanderbilt's History of the Family, Fortune's Children, Reginald lost $70,000 gambling on the night of his 21st birthday, the night the money first came into his hands. He drank and wagered through the rest in the years that followed, and he died of cirrhosis of the liver at 45. The cash inheritance was gone long before he was. But here is the detail that illuminates the architecture of the entire Vanderbilt collapse, because it turns one man's life into a controlled experiment. The trust held. The $5 million that had been locked behind a legal structure, the one piece of the Vanderbilt fortune with a wall around it, survived Reginald's drinking and gambling intact. When he died, it passed $6,250,000 to his daughters. The outright cash was gone. But the trust was not. The same man, the same appetites, the same lifetime, and the only difference between the money that vanished and the money that endured was whether someone had built a wall around it. Reginald Vanderbilt is the clearest proof in the entire family that the ruin was not about character. It was about structure. The money inside the trust survived. The cash did not. If William Henry Vanderbilt had placed all of his children's inheritances behind the same kind of legal wall, the Vanderbilt fortune might look like the Rockefeller fortune today. Reginald's $5 million trust proves it. The structure worked, but it was never applied to the rest of the money. And then there was the youngest son, the one who did not build a palace to live in, but who built one that no one would be able to afford. George Washington Vanderbilt, the youngest of William Henry's sons, took his inheritance of about $10 million and spent half of it on a single idea. Biltmore, a house of 250 rooms in North Carolina, surrounded by 125,000 acres of forest and farmland, built from 1889 to 1895 at a cost of between $5 and $6 million. Half of everything George had poured into one estate. It was the largest private home in America, and it generated no income whatsoever. Denise Kiernan, his biographer, wrote in The Last Castle that George burned through almost all of his inheritance building and maintaining the estate. She called it an architectural albatross. The comparison was precise. Biltmore was too large to heat and too expensive to staff, and unlike the Newport cottages, which at least served a social function during the season, Biltmore served no function that could pay for itself. It consumed money without limit and without return. George had done with Biltmore what his brothers had done with Newport cottages and Fifth Avenue mansions, but he had done it with half the starting capital, $5 to $6 million out of $10 million, into a building that produced nothing. The proportion tells the story. When half your inheritance goes into a house that generates no revenue, the other half must carry the entire weight of living, and it cannot carry it for long. George died in 1914 at 51, and left behind his widow, Edith Vanderbilt, a daughter named Cornelia, and an estate that was almost all house and almost no cash, the largest private home in America, and nothing in the bank to keep it standing. The pattern was the same as every other branch of the family: outright money, no trust, no structure, and nothing to catch the fall. But the difference in this branch is what the widow did next. The spending generation, by this point, had written its chapter. Cornelius the Second had held his share even and weaponized his will. Alfred had burned through 2/5 of his and died on the Lusitania at 37. William Kissam had run in place for 35 years and replaced nothing. Reginald had gambled and drunk his cash to nothing, proving by accident that the trust was the only part of the fortune with a future. George had poured half his inheritance into a house that would never earn a dollar, and Cornelius the Third had been erased from the ledger for the offense of choosing a wife. Not one of them had built a business. Not one had created a trust, or an endowment, or an institution to carry the money forward. They had spent it the way the will allowed them to spend it, and the will had allowed them to spend it all. The mechanism was never bad luck. It was never a single disastrous investment, never a crash, never a swindle. Per Arthur Vanderbilt's Fortune's Children, the force that destroyed the largest fortune in America was the simplest force in the world: the absence of structure. William Henry Vanderbilt handed his children $200 million as outright cash and railroad stock. No trust locked the principal. There was no family office to manage the holdings as a single enterprise. No covenant prevented any heir from spending his entire share in a decade if he chose. The money became personal property the moment it changed hands, and personal property follows the appetites of the person who holds it. So the heirs spent, and when they died, the money split again among their children into smaller and smaller shares, each one as unprotected as the first. The fortune did not collapse in a single event. It dispersed. Cash in, cash out, split and repeat, and nothing underneath any of it to slow the fall. That is what makes the Rockefeller comparison so devastating. John D. Rockefeller built his fortune on the same scale, in the same era, in the same country, oil instead of railroads, but the numbers were comparable and the families moved through the same circles of Gilded Age society. The difference is what the Rockefellers did with the money after the founder was gone. The family diversified out of oil, locked the core of the fortune into irrevocable dynasty trusts in 1934, and ran everything through a single professional family office, room 5600, at 30 Rockefeller Plaza in Manhattan. That office had professional staff, formal governance, and written rules on how each generation could draw from the pool. No individual heir could touch the principal. No divorce settlement, no gambling debt, and no summer cottage could reach the core of the money because the core had been placed behind a legal wall that no one in the family had the authority to remove. 6 generations later, the Rockefellers remain among the wealthiest families in America. The Vanderbilts, who started with the same fortune, in the same country, in the same century, had nothing by 1973. Same money, same era, opposite architecture, and opposite result. The only variable between the two families is the one decision made at the top of each family tree, whether the money went to the heirs as cash or into a trust. That single decision determined whether the fortune would last 1 generation or 6. The comparison is not a metaphor. It is the closest thing to a controlled experiment that economic history offers. 2 families, same era, same scale, same society. One locked the money into trusts, the other handed it over as cash. One family remains wealthy, the other gathered for a reunion and could not find a millionaire among them. By 1907, about 30 years after the Commodore's death, no Vanderbilt ranked among the wealthiest Americans. The family that had held the largest fortune in the country had dropped off the list. The palaces they had built at such cost were coming down. Cornelius the Second's Fifth Avenue mansion, the largest private home in New York City, was sold and slated for demolition. His widow Alice opened the doors to the public for one afternoon at 50 cents a head, with the proceeds going to charity. New Yorkers walked through the rooms where the Vanderbilt family had received the highest tier of American society, paid their 50 cents, and went home. Wrecking crews came next. The site where the greatest fortune in America had lived, became the department store Bergdorf Goodman. The house that had taken 37 servants to run, the largest private residence in the greatest city in the country, was now a retail floor where strangers browsed. Every dollar had run out, and the monument went with it. And when about 120 of the family's descendants gathered at Vanderbilt University in 1973 for a reunion, per Arthur Vanderbilt's Fortune's children, there was not a millionaire among them. Not one. The largest personal fortune in the world, spent to nothing inside a single generation after the man who split it died. The money was not stolen. It was not swindled. It was spent by the people who were given it, because nothing had ever been built to stop them. But the collapse was not inevitable. And the proof is the Vanderbilts who chose a different path. Not every heir spent the money, and not every branch went to zero. And the Vanderbilts who kept their fortunes proved that the collapse was a decision made by the majority, not a sentence imposed by fate. Frederick William Vanderbilt, the third of William Henry's sons, inherited about $10 million, the same amount as each of the younger children. And he did the one thing that no other Vanderbilt of his generation managed. He grew it. Over more than 50 years, without fanfare, without scandal, and without a single palace that drained the capital, Frederick grew his $10 million into $79,845,478 per the appraisal of his estate. An eightfold increase, the best stewardship in the family by any measure. He left millions to Yale University's Sheffield School and to Vanderbilt University, and when he died in 1938, his branch of the fortune was larger than most of the other branches combined. Nobody tells Frederick Vanderbilt's story. There is no drama in it, no shipwreck, no gambling on a birthday night. He did the quiet work of managing the money, and because no one else in the family did that work, his ledger is the most extraordinary one in the Vanderbilt line. The same starting fortune, the same era, the same country, and an eightfold increase where every other branch showed a wash or a decline. The difference was not talent or genius. Frederick paid attention to the money, and because he did, it grew. Harold Sterling Vanderbilt, William Kissam's younger son, inherited $21,739,867, and he more than doubled it. He left more than $40 million to Vanderbilt University and $6,600,000 to Harvard. He won 3 America's Cup yacht races on the water off Newport, invented the modern game of contract bridge, and sat on the board of the New York Central Railroad as the last Vanderbilt to hold a seat there, forced off only by a hostile takeover in 1954. Harold lived well. He raced yachts and kept houses and moved through the world with the ease of a man born into money. But he treated the fortune as capital, not as spending cash, and when he died in 1970, his estate was larger than what he had received. 2 men out of 8 who chose to manage the money rather than consume it, and both left behind more than they were given. 2 out of 8 children had done what the others could not bring themselves to do. They managed the inheritance instead of consuming it, and between them, Frederick and Harold proved that the Vanderbilt fortune was not cursed. It was not fated to disappear. The fortune disappeared in the branches where no one managed it, and held in the branches where someone did. The same fortune, the same era, and the outcome depended on nothing more than whether the heir who held it chose to manage or to spend. And then there was Edith. When George died in 1914, he left Edith Vanderbilt an inheritance that was, in practical terms, a catastrophe. Biltmore, 250 rooms in North Carolina, grounds that stretched 125,000 acres, and the bank account behind it was almost empty. The running cost of the estate consumed money by the month, and there was no income in the Vanderbilt ledger to replace what went out. A lesser heir might have sold the property and walked away with whatever the market offered. Edith did not sell. She made 3 decisions, and each one was harder than the last. First, she sold 86,700 acres to the United States Forest Service at $5 an acre, about $433,000, to shed the crushing carrying cost of the land. That acreage became Pisgah National Forest. She gave away the greater part of the property to save the core of it. It was the kind of decision the spending heirs had never been forced to make, because they had always had enough cash to avoid the hard choices. Edith had no cash, so she made the cut, and the land that had been a burden became a national forest, and the estate that had been drowning was one step closer to staying afloat. Second, she refused to sell the art and the furnishings. The paintings, the tapestries, and the full collection George had assembled stayed in the house. Edith understood that the house without its contents was a shell, and a shell had no future. The art was not decoration. It was the reason anyone would ever come. Selling it would have raised cash in the short term and killed the house in the long term, and Edith had the clarity to see the difference. And third, in March of 1930, in the teeth of the Great Depression, she opened Biltmore to paying visitors. No Vanderbilt heir of that generation would have considered charging the public to walk through a family home. Edith did it because it was the only move left, and it worked. The admission fees kept the lights on. What had been a private burden became a place the public could visit, and that single change of purpose saved the estate. The house that had been an albatross became a destination, and the decision that no other Vanderbilt would have made is the reason one Vanderbilt palace is still standing today. Edith Vanderbilt treated the fortune as something to save. She did not spend it the way the spending heirs had spent theirs, did not pour it into marble or titles or gambling debts. She took an inheritance that should have buried her, made the decisions the others never made, and built something that could survive her. Edith made the decisions the other heirs never made, and the house survived because she did. Her daughter told a different story. Cornelia Stuyvesant Vanderbilt was born on the 22nd of August, 1900, in the house her father built. Her father's will left her a trust worth millions, to come to her at 25. She married a British aristocrat named John Cecil in 1924, and with him, she stood beside her mother when Biltmore first opened its doors to the public in 1930. Then she left. She found the life at Biltmore confining. She went to New York and then to Paris to study art. In 1934, she divorced Cecil and never returned to the estate or to the United States. She reportedly changed her name to Neeltje, for reasons she attributed to numerology, and dyed her hair pink. In 1972, she married a former waiter named William Goodsir, 26 years her junior. She died in 1976 on a farm in the English county of Oxfordshire, a long way from any Vanderbilt drawing room. Her ashes were carried, years later, to a churchyard in the Orkney Islands. She had inherited a trust, a name, and a house that was the largest in the country. She kept none of them. The girl born in the largest house in America ended her life on a farm in the English countryside. Biltmore survived without her. Her former husband, Cecil, and their 2 sons carried the house forward, and it remains in family hands today. Cornelia did not doom the house by leaving, but her story stands beside her mother's as the clearest illustration of what the Vanderbilt fortune always came down to. Edith stayed and built a structure that could hold. Cornelia walked away and became someone else. Frederick William Vanderbilt started with about $10 million, the same share as every younger sibling in the family. When he died in 1938, his estate was appraised at $79,845,478. Same fortune, same era, same country, same name.